I'd like to begin by talking about this notion of the expansion of consciousness, symbolized in this wonderful 17th century engraving. And it was actually a concept that originated with Tim Leary to describe these experiences with substances that were later called psychedelic. I've come to the place where I no longer like to use the term psychedelic because it's become like a genre of pop art. It refers to my 10-year-old daughter came back from grade school one day and said, "Oh, that's like psychedelic." Swirling paisley pattern. Now, swirling paisley pattern is not psychedelic. Psychedelic means mind manifesting. And so because of that, and it's interesting that consciousness expansion, Albert Hofmann, who discovered LSD and psilocybin, or invented them, discovered them, he always said he discovered them rather than invented them, actually liked that notion better than any of the psychiatric terminology, even although he was a chemist working for a medical pharmaceutical company, Sandoz. And because he thought right at the beginning, based on his own experience with these substances, that they should not be just limited to medical and psychiatric research. He said, yes, of course, medical and psychiatric therapy and all that kind of thing should be explored, but that's not all of it. It should also be explored the aesthetic, artistic, creative aspects of it, and the mystical. Mystical aspects. Albert Hofmann was a visionary, besides being a scientist. In fact, the inspiration for his scientific life came out of a mystical experience he had as a child. And he's written about this. He was walking in the mountains in Switzerland, and as a 9-year-old boy, and he suddenly was overcome by this feeling of being encompassed and embraced by the entire world, just in a all-embracing cosmic love feeling. And he said to himself as a child, well, I'll never be able to describe this or paint it or express it in any way. I just can't see how I could do that. I think I'll study it and become a scientist. And it was his memory of that experience that enabled him to recognize when he had accidentally absorbed some small amount of LSD that this is what had happened. That because he was working on natural ergot alkaloids in medicine, and he started having these strange experiences, unlike any drug experience ever had before. He was unfamiliar with any of the previous literature on consciousness-expanding drugs, like with mescaline. He did not know about it. He was a very hardcore, mainstream, journeyman chemist. And because in his experience that he then had with that substance, he was reminded of his mystical vision as a child. And in that mystical vision of a child, then from that, he knew it must be a natural substance. It must be something to do with the ergot I was working on, that I ingested. So this notion of consciousness expansion is a very interesting one that I would recommend to your attention. Because many of us, I think, don't think about it. Makes you ask yourself the question, consciousness could be expanded? Who knew, right? Actually, consciousness expansion happens every morning when you wake up. Right? It happens every morning when you wake up because you're in a dream, let's say, or even you're pursuing some dream imagery, and then suddenly you gradually become aware of the fact, that's in my mind somewhere, and here's my body, here's the rest of my body, here's my arms and legs and body, lying in a bed next to my spouse or sleeping partner, and there's a room. I become aware of a whole other world that I actually am familiar with, and I could even expand further, like, outside is the house, is the garden, and outside the garden is the town, and on and on. Consciousness can also be contracted. So this is Paracelsus, a great 16th century visionary scientist, the first to really systematically use the method of empirical medicine to empirical science, observational empirical science in medicine. being able to identify cures. He had a connection with the herbalist women, primarily herbalists in the woods outside of the city-state culture, who preserved ancient knowledge of plants and herbs and minerals that could be used in healing. As a result, he was a successful healer. As a result, he was often driven out of town and forced to take cover from the then emissaries of the medical inquisition. And this is an alchemical image of the union of fire and water. And the way I interpret alchemical imagery is that it refers to a process of physical, emotional, mental, spiritual transformation, self-transformation, where the symbolism of the vessel, the retort, is the human psychophysical, spiritual organism as a totality. And it has, of course, the physical aspects of healing, and the emotional, mental, that's that we nowadays would consider psychology, psychotherapy, and so forth, and the spiritual aspect, which we divide all these areas up into different disciplines. They don't talk to one another, and science and religion is completely different realms. Of course, that's not true. So it introduces a distortion right from the start. And union of fire and water, one way to interpret that would be the fiery energies within us, which are associated with the nervous system. Nervous system is electromagnetic system, and the watery system, which is hormonal, and the blood, which is more emotional. The water symbolism of in general, is more the emotional. Emotions rise and fall like waves, and are associated with hormones and the blood, the circulation of the blood. And perception is more like the fiery element, electromagnetic transmission along the nerves, the central nervous system on the autonomic nervous system. And so this refers to an integration of the emotional and nervous elements of the body. And the other two elements, air and water, would be air and earth. Air would be the mental, and earth would be the physical. Okay, next slide. This is a picture of two great scientists who I discuss in my book, The Expansion of Consciousness. The first part of it is a kind of history of alchemy, and how alchemy was a science of a totality corresponding to really shamanism and yoga. I say shamanism is the oldest science and knowledge system of transformation on the planet, and alchemy and yoga are sort of the Western and Eastern developments and extension of it, with the difference being that alchemy became illegal in the West because it dealt with spiritual matters, and anything outside of the church dealing with spiritual matter is considered illegal. And so it went underground, so it couldn't develop to the same extent that yoga could. But then it was revived in the 20th century. See, all of Western science colluded with this suppression of alchemy, because they said, well, we want to keep our jobs and we want to keep our heads, because people used to go, burned at the stake for practicing alchemy. So like witchcraft. So Jung, was one of the first to rediscover the alchemical tradition, interpreting the alchemical literature as symbolic literature, talking about psychological processes, what we call the unconscious. The alchemy, he said, alchemy is the language of the unconscious. Because it recognizes the thing. What he didn't realize that it's the unconscious, but it's not just images and thoughts, or primordial images or archetypal images. It's also the physical body, you see. And this is not a criticism. This is just like we all, advance knowledge as far as we can, and then we can only go so far. So for him, for Jung, the physical aspect, actual bodily aspect, that's inherent in the alchemical process or any other process of transformation was missing. And so I think that Hoffman stumbled upon, accidentally, serendipitously, with a serendipity, an unexpected discovery with fortunate, far-reaching consequences. The missing link between body and mind that the alchemists had been searching for. And I don't say that LSD or these other drugs are the philosopher's stone that they talked about. The philosopher's stone is a condition of consciousness, of absolute knowledge, certain knowledge, unshakable rock-bottom knowledge. And the philosopher's stone, they used to say, you can find it anywhere. It's all around us, but we don't see it. Even in the sky, it can be on the ground, can be in the tree, can be in the water, can be in the human being. So it's not fixed, you see, but it's ultimate fixity. So anyway, so Jung knew nothing about these substances, And Hoffmann knew nothing about what Jung did, and they didn't know. They were both Swiss. One was from Basel and one was from Zurich. They didn't know of each other. That's interesting, isn't it? This is another one from this series of images about the four elements, the union of fire and water. So this is the wind has carried it in his womb. So it's a sort of man carrying a baby. No, it's kind of peculiar. But the elements fire and air are considered masculine because the energy rises upward. Elements water and earth are considered feminine because the energy sinks down, flows down. So it's receptive. And so in an alchemical text called the Emerald Tablet, it says, the wind has carried it in its belly. So the wind representing the mind has carried it. What is it? It is the Philosopher's Stone, the idea of transformation, the idea of attaining a higher state of consciousness, the idea of connecting to the divine. And the wind is carried in its belly. You start with a conception, right? A concept is a conception. A conception. Before birth. Before birth is a conception. Has to be. So you first have to have the idea, and then the feelings associated with it. Then the actions that make it happen. And then it is nursed by the earth. You have the conception, and you have the birth. You see, it's the same image the alchemists used to say. The fetus. You're developing a fetus here in your retorts. So there's a symbolic resonance between the processes in the laboratory that the alchemists were looking at, and the processes of human life. Except they weren't allowed to say that directly, because that would be, going into the realm of religion and spirituality, and the deepest mysteries. And so they put it in these obscure symbols. The conception has to be birthed. To be birthed all the way, it has to be brought all down to the physical. And we know that from embryology, something like people debate between 40 and 50 conceptions that take place don't actually get implanted in the womb. It's the biggest die-off, one of the biggest die-offs in human life. 40 to 50% of conceptions don't get implanted. So it already, from the journey of conception to implantation, where it actually takes root in the womb and starts to develop, is a very significant step. So it has to be nursed. At that point, the mother's body starts nourishing the embryo, and so it develops the fetus and eventually gives birth to the fetus, and then the mother and the father and the community and the family raise the child, and the child gradually expands its capabilities and functional capabilities. So the second in the series of books that I'm writing on the ecology of consciousness is called The Roots of War and Domination. It may seem a little bit off the theme here, but I was a war child. I was born in 1936, and I lived the first 10 years of my life in Hitler's Germany during the Second World War. And I've come to think of that as being somehow an indication, as it is on other people too, that the conditions of your rising and your parents being from two different countries that are actually fighting the war against the countries against each other. So experiencing that, so war has been an obsession for me all my life, and I would say that I was actually in a state of trauma from childhood on, from the end 1949, during the actual war itself, 1939. During the war itself, we were in Berlin. We didn't have any bombs dropped in our house, so we were relatively safe. But 1945, the collapse of the nation. It's an interesting thing to live in a state that's a nation state, your community that's actually collapsing, where there's invading armies, speaking foreign languages, and ruined houses all over the place. This is, of course, an experience that's commonplace in the world today, but it was, our experience, and it's an experience that marks you for the rest of your life. It can't help not. So, and I would say that actually, the way I understand it now, I was in a state of PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, from the age of 9 when I was 1945, when I was 9 to the age of, 25. When I first took a psychedelic consciousness expanding substances under the auspices of Harvard University with the guidance of Timothy Leary. who coined the term consciousness expanding, when I suddenly realized for the first time that all my thoughts and all my feelings and perceptions and all of that was going on inside of me, not in any kind of external reality. So, therefore, it was up to me to change it. And then I became very interested in methods of changing consciousness. You can see why. Just briefly to finish on the Roots of War thing, that book is basically my attempt to run through, so what are the causes of this weird thing that people do where they actually kill one another in mass amounts, on and on and on and on and on. War is the opposite of civilization. It destroys civilizations. It's the opposite of civilization. Civilizations is not war. So it's a very peculiar and strange and horrible situation that exists on this planet and still exists. Okay, so alchemical divination. So alchemy, as I mentioned already, can be seen like with shamanism and with yoga and system of transformation. Divination means asking questions and receiving answers. Asking questions from a source that's more knowledgeable. Usually it's associated with things like the tarot, astrology, or things like that. But the basic core of a divination is asking a question within yourself, you see, and then looking for an answer within yourself rather than symbolically. And that's what divination is. So I teach these methods of divination, meditative methods. They don't involve drugs. They could, but they don't, for obvious reasons of practicality and legality. And they're not essential to it, you see. The drugs act, the psychedelic consciousness-expanding drugs act, I have now come to the way I now understand them, as amplifiers of perception. There is no such thing as a drug effect in the case of these drugs. There's no such thing as a drug effect. You can't say this drug does that or this drug does that. It's not like stimulants or depressants or any other drug known to humankind. Consciousness expanding means, well, what's going on in your consciousness? It depends, you see. Of course, they can be used for healing, but they can be used for commit murder and mayhem, like they were with Charlie Manson, a mass murderer. So alchemical divination is a process of describing a system for accessing your spiritual intelligence. You know, we talk about the mental, the creative intelligence, the mathematical intelligence, the verbal, analytical, logical intelligence, the different kinds of intelligence. And I say the spiritual intelligence is this intelligence that recognizes the multi-levels. It's including the spiritual, not excluding the spiritual. You see, you can't exclude the spiritual and expect to get a complete picture of the human being. It's false. So it must include all levels, from the spiritual to the physical. Spirit, that's the ancient used to say, spirit, soul, mind, body. And then later they reduced it to just spirit, mind, and body, left out soul somewhere along the line in the Middle Ages, I think. And then it came to Descartes, it's just mind and body. I think, therefore I am, just mind and body. And then it came to 20th century behaviorism, and then let's forget about thinking. We can't get inside the black box anyway. It's just a box, it's just behavior. So the ultimate decline of spirituality, soul, mind, everything reduced to behaviorism. Of course, now we're recovering from behaviorism, but okay, so this is my basic formula. Of course, you all know it and understand it. The little arrow means directs or intent, or symbolizes, determines. Your intention determines your attention. Your intention determines what you'll attend to. Your intention is to come here and listen to me, which I appreciate, thank you, and my colleagues. And my intention is to communicate, so you're giving me your attention. It's interesting that in English we say pay attention. It involves like doing something. It's not just passively sitting there, you see. It's paying attention. In German they say schenk die Aufmerksamkeit. It's a gift, actually. Schenken is a gift. Schenken, so it's a slight difference, but the same idea that you're giving something. You're not just passively receiving, you see. And that intention, of course, is based on interest. And I think brain scientists are now at the point where they actually think they have identified a little action event that happens in the brain, in a certain area of the brain that is an intention just a few microseconds before the actual action. And intention could also be a question. For example, you have the intention of coming here and listening to these talks, or you could have formulated a question which would be, I wonder what they will say that I can receive. you see. So a question is more, asking a question is a basic gesture of receptivity. And my friend Rupert Sheldrake used to say that basically, a scientific experiment is a way of setting up a question to nature. You set up a questioning situation to nature and ask in order to get the answer. That's why you have to control all the random variables. So, fine, attention then, intention determines what you're going to attend to, and then what you'll become aware of. And that's always a limit, you see. Then you're not so aware of stuff that's going on outside this present sphere of attention and communication. But you could become aware of it. It could be interrupted. If an elephant walked through the room or a naked man, then all our attention would be captured, so to speak. As we say, captured or captivated, and subject to an extreme stimulus of some kind. But then basically, we want to get it back to our intention or question. So here in this formula from one of my books, this is extended a little bit, that formula into a fourfold cycle. You start with the intention, interest on the left, you attention at the top, you're tracking and selecting out of all the things you could attend to, you select certain things, your focus, that you focus on, and then you perceive and sense something. And what you perceive or sense could be a target image or an object or a scene of some kind. Now, in the footnote says the target may be in the past, it may be a memory, or in the future, a vision, or precognition, or presentiment, or non-local present, what we call remote viewing. Under certain special conditions, you can remotely view something that you're not in any kind of contact with. Or it can be the internal perception of an internal emotional state, of a symbolic image of some kind, like in a dream. And so after you get a hit, so to speak, of the target, then you start relating it and associating it, connecting it to other things, previous things that you've seen and know. And then there's this concept of apperception. Very interesting word. One of my teachers at Harvard was a man called Henry Murray. He invented a test called the TAT, which is Thematic Apperception Test. That's a personality diagnostic test. You look at a picture that's unspecified of some people doing something or other, a man and a woman doing something or other, making kind of gestures, but there's no text. And you have to project into it what's the scene, see what's the happening. So it's like, apperception means the sort of cloud of associations around perception that add to the perception of the particular target. Awareness of the context, you said context. And then reflecting on what you've seen, integrating it. Whoa, what I saw. In other words, it's a feedback system, you see, and constantly self-correcting itself. This is the fourth book in the series, Mind, Space, and Time Stream, Understanding and Navigating Your States of Consciousness, where I look at all the states of consciousness. I no longer use the concept altered state because alterations, because it suggests something pathological. Somebody has been altered, as if there was some normal state that we shouldn't deviate from. So this is nonsense because we alter our consciousness all the time. It happens every day, every morning when you woke up, it's an alteration of consciousness. Every night when you fall asleep, it's another alteration of consciousness. Then we have other ones, major or minor, like we get drunk and have a drink or smoke a joint, or those kinds of things that we're all familiar with. But every time you get into a state of intense fear, that's an alteration of consciousness. It's a contraction of consciousness. You only focus on the same with anger. Fear and anger are contractive states of consciousness where you only focus what's immediately happening in a situation. So in this book I try to look at what's true of all states of consciousness. And one of the key things to realize is a state of consciousness is a period of time. It's a definition of a period of time during which your mind, your emotions, your perceptions are functioning according to certain ways. When the consciousness altered, then time and space are completely different. For example, in a dream, an altered state, you may meet with your grandmother who lives thousands of miles away and have this wonderful heart-to-heart conversation with her. She may be dead, and then you exchange real feelings and have real feelings, and communications take place and all of that. And then you're living in a completely different time. The dream has a sequence, but it's completely unrelated. to the time. So every time you change your consciousness, you enter into a different time stream and also space. You see, it didn't take several hours to traverse the space between you and where your grandmother lived. You were as close as you feel. Closeness and distance are emotional in the dream state. And other states of consciousness, they also, LSD states or psychedelic states, time differences are a crucial thing. So this is another way there's many different ways of approaching consciousness. So here's the column on the left is an ordinary habitual function, and the column on the left is like conscious function with greater awareness, with greater context. Just adding this is not such a state of consciousness, this is a function. You see, a functional definition. So like perception and apperception. And sympathy and empathy, I distinguish sympathy and empathy that way. Sympathy being like unconscious, somebody's sad and I feel sad with them, without even knowing anything about it. Empathy is more conscious, has an element of understanding, and it also has an element of, I recognize that you are you, and you are having this state of consciousness, and I feel with you, but I am me, and I'm not in the same state of consciousness. Because one of the things that we're so attuned to each other, we can have automatic reactions that, sympathetic reaction, including with states of anger, which is extremely dangerous and manifests in politics and war all the time. People let's all get pissed off at Osama bin Laden, and aren't we glad now that he's dead now? Because we really want him to be dead. What is that? So knowledge and understanding, there's a common distinction that's made. Knowledge and information, knowing something about something versus wisdom and understanding it. See? Understanding means you can actually stand on it. It's interesting language. See how interesting language is? You understand something, you can actually stand on it. It's not a belief. It's not a belief. You don't have evidence for it. You understand it. And then reaction, response, a kind of an obvious one. Reaction, somebody hurts you and you go, ouch, or whatever. Response is like you think about it. How am I going to respond to this person interpersonally? Orientation, you see, that's an orienting reflex. Animals have it. Plants do it. Plants orient towards the light. It's a plant. It's unconscious from the human point of view. And attention being like where you decide to, you intend to attend. And then things like expectation, impulse, desire, intentional interest. You get the point. And then sensing, just sensory awareness, but sensory awareness can be infinitely expanded with all kinds of extra special types of subtle sense perception, or higher sense perception, as they call it, clairsentience, clear sensing, as they sometimes say. Habitual thinking versus mindful thinking. See. Is your thinking just going along the usual conditioned thought patterns, automatic conditioned things that we all do, or is it mindful thinking? And then dreaming, lucid dreaming, judgment, discerning. I think I have to speed up. How much time do I have left? Couple of minutes. Jeez, I'm only about halfway through. Okay. Let's see. What's the most? Let's just go fast. Okay, let's just go fast. Okay, it's in one of my books, the general diagram of altered states of consciousness, set and setting. Okay, next slide. I just don't have the time, sorry. You see, I tend to ramble on. And this is a different dimension. This is a dimension of arousal of consciousness versus pleasure, pain. This is not the expansion of consciousness. This is where stimulant and sedative drugs, you see, you can put in this dimension, but you can't put consciousness expanding drugs there because they go all over the place instead of high or low or pleasure, pain. So next slide. This is the same idea put in the form of a psychological test. Next slide. Okay, so this again is getting the idea across of what does it mean to expand consciousness. In a baseline state, there's an arc of attention. My arc of attention is this thing like here, and yours is like that. And then expanding means, expanding, becoming more aware of other things outside that arc. So expanded state. Okay. You get the idea. And this is the opposite. The opposite is also true. That's called focusing, concentration, right? Instead of, it would be like the equivalent of me, instead of looking at all of you, would be like looking at one of you and concentrating. And the contracted states and fixation. Now, fixation actually means fixing. Contraction and expansion of consciousness are perfectly normal functions. And but when they become fixated, then you get the things that we call addictions, compulsions, and obsessions. Fixate. Nothing wrong with drinking alcohol, but if you drink alcohol over and over, or take the same drug over and over, or eat, excessively over and over, it's obviously a pathological condition. It's a fixated contraction. This is the latest book in this series, The Life Cycle of the Human Soul. Go through the sequences in your mind. Incarnation, conception, birth, death, hereafter, reincarnation. So in this book I talk about birth and all the research, new research on prenatal experience. I'm a social scientist. This is empirical studies I'm talking about. Of course, they verge on the spiritual and so forth. And same with death and the afterlife, near-death experiences, all of that. And how does that relate to traditional ideas of alchemy and shamanism and yoga and the spiritual traditions of ancient times called death rebirth traditions? Okay, back the expansion of consciousness again. Expansion of our worldview, you see. Expansion of our worldview. That's not a state of consciousness. It's an expansion of our ordinary consciousness of what we think of, this is, what kind of a world we live in. And we're now going, in the 16th century, we changed our worldview from being a geocentric to a heliocentric. We're now going to a worldview of, that's, I think, the meaning of 2012. If we're moving to a galactic center, we're realizing that our solar system with all its planets is part of a much, much larger cosmic system of 200 million stars. 200 million stars! Whirling around the galactic core. And there's an alignment, you see, with our equinoctial axis with the center of the galaxy. That's what 2012 happens. The psychedelic culture, which got born in the 60s, and the underground culture is important to recognize as an underground culture. It's not a counterculture. It's not opposed to the mainstream culture. It's underground. It's hidden. It has to be hidden. Why? Because it was forbidden. Didn't have to be hidden, but it was, in fact, ended up being forbidden. And it may be, and I think I agree with Johnny in that regard, or we both agree on this, that these cultures are generally, that involve consciousness expansion, are generally forced to go underground because not because they want to, but because they want to survive. And we have good examples in nature. The fungal kingdom is all underground, you see. The little mushrooms that pop up are just the sense organs. The vast mycelial networks is the real body of it. It's invisible. It's invisible. It's under the ground. So these are 4 people, all whom were killed in the 60s for their views and for their attempts to liberate human consciousness for their communities. So birth of a psychedelic culture. So I already said conversations about Leary, the Harvard experiments, Millbrook in the 60s. It covers a 5-year period from the beginnings of the studies at Harvard and then Millbrook, and then ending up with dispersing and going in different directions. Leary and Alpert, when they were still Harvard professors, 1961. 1963, a scene in the City Lights restaurant, Lawrence Ferlinghetti on the right, Tim Leary, Peggy Hitchcock, a friend of our group, close, wonderful lady, and Allen Ginsberg sitting in a restaurant. It's a photograph from the book. This is a tower on the beach where we had these psychedelic training centers in Zihuatanejo, Mexico. This is one of Leary's genius inspirations. He said, let's have one person sitting in a tower on the beach looking out over the ocean, high on LSD all the time. So he'd be sort of the reference for all the rest of us while we were going about our ordinary things of, daily life, that we could tune into somebody, live person being in this high state of consciousness. Okay, this was when we were being scientists there, you see. This is with an event called by Ogden Lindley's behavioral index with different categories, so that the idea was that when we were in a state, we were working with DMT, which is a short-acting psychedelic, you'd be able to identify, okay, I'm having this experience of internal sensations or imaginary something or other. So there'd be a series of 5 or 6 buttons that you could push, because you wouldn't have time to talk, you see. So that's what we were doing there. And see, we did the right thing to be scientists, and we weren't against science anyway. Neither then nor now. And this is the house at Millbrook, which Alan Atwell, the painter, painted a wonderful house in that we lived in. I went on a trip to India on a pilgrimage and then Tim Leary followed shortly afterwards, and we met at the Taj Mahal, and we took LSD there. The woman is Nena, the woman that he had just married just before they went to India. They came to India on a honeymoon. I was already there, and we met there. And she later, after they came back from the trip, I tell that story in the Birth for Psychedelic Culture book. Their marriage was over, and she went on to marry Robert Thurman, and their daughter, Robert Thurman, and Nena's daughter is the actress Uma Thurman. And this is 1966, so this is in the midst of where psychedelic researchers sort of engulfed the whole country. Allen Ginsberg and Leary and myself standing in front of a paper-mache Buddha, getting the vulgarity aspects in place. This is Leary's first encounter with the law in Laredo, where he was busted for following the border. Went on a trial. He looks cheerful, doesn't he? That was the one thing about Leary. He was always cheerful. He made it his life's game. So it's a theory of life is a game. To always maintain cheerfulness, even when you're in horrible circumstances, like facing a life sentence or in jail. Ram Dass, Alpert went to India, came back. Ram Dass, and 1980s, this is where I'm the academic dean at Harvard University, and we're giving an honorary degree to Richard Alpert Ram Dass before he became crippled through a stroke. 10 years later, that's it. Thank you very much.